Welcome, everybody. It's actually really nice to see so many of you here. We were a little worried the day after spring break, were you actually going to come back? I see a few people with what look like tans, so it seems like you probably had a reasonable spring break. I'm John Haigh. I am the co-director of the Mosava Rahmani Center for Business and Government, and we have with us again today Jon Sallet. I see familiar faces from our class. In some ways, this will be a little bit of an extension of the class. John will talk a lot more, and I'll give him a hard time on some things on occasion. We have also our normal crowd of Nancy Rose from MIT, Tom Wheeler, FCC, Gene Kimmelman, Yale, but we don't hold that against him too much. And I think you know John's background. John is a senior fellow here at CBG. He is also a special assistant attorney general for the state of Colorado. And I don't know how many of you are following this, but he is therefore incredibly closely entwined in the government's lawsuit against Google for antitrust violations. And has been doing examining and cross-examining of witnesses, preparing briefs and things like that. He is the litigator in the Google search trial. And then prior to that, he worked as general counsel of the FCC. Unfortunately, he had to work for Tom Wheeler, but Tom was the chair of the FCC at the time, and he's been in the antitrust division of the Department of Justice and director of the Office of Policy and Strategic Planning for the Department of Commerce. So he has a broad breadth of perspectives and issues. The topic today, as you can see on the screen, is big tech and competitive harm, finding the best path to innovation. I will turn it over to John. We will try to make sure we leave some time at the end for questions, but I think we may choose to interrupt him in the interim if we have questions ourselves. Thanks.
Thank you, John. Is this working okay? Yes? People can hear me? Okay. As John's introduction demonstrates, I've never been able to keep a job for very long, but I appreciate the chance to have this gig and talk to you in what, as John described accurately, as if we'd released an album on streaming services last fall, but now we're adding a bonus track. Let me just start, as I always do on this, by saying I am in the Google case. I'm going to talk a little bit about the liability decision. I'm not going to talk about the remedies process because opening argument on that is April 21st. Maybe I should save my answers to questions for then. But I am going to offer personal views. They don't necessarily represent the view of the Colorado AG's office, for whom I work. And as always, and we did this in the class last fall, I may offer an opinion. I would love to be challenged on it, and it's important that you reach your own views. I'm going to give you some perspectives. Also, we want to thank, John and I want to thank Jack and Bhavani and Lenny, the research assistants that are working with us this semester and helping us create a body of materials, a small portion of which will be in this presentation, but the full bulk of which will be part of our foundation going forward, including for our class that we teach next fall. The same class, but with lots of new events because the world is moving fast in big tech and competition. I want to focus today on mergers and the question of how mergers fit against innovation and competition questions. I want to talk about the particular question that's been raised about startup companies, and how merger reviews should take into account the desire of startups and their financial backers to profit from the investment and the innovation they create. I want to then drill down on a particular problem called the ex-ante problem. How does merger reviews affect future investment? And if we have a moment at the end, because we do want to save time for questions, I want to talk a little bit about the Competition and Markets Authority in the United Kingdom and its handling of Microsoft Activision, a merger that has gained some considerable political controversy in the United Kingdom in the last few months. So let's start on the startups. I wanted to have the Rolling Stones Start Me Up as the theme music here, but everybody told me nobody in the group would remember the song. So let's just go back to the Jason Furman's report in the UK in 2019. And just as a brief refresher, remind ourselves what are the key characteristics of the big tech markets we're talking about. In many cases, digital markets are subject to tipping, in which a winner will take most of the market. That's a result of network effects and scale advantages in the first instance. But it's been a considerable emphasis on this fact that maybe these markets are prone to have bigger, more dominant companies than others. Importantly, concentration in digital markets can have benefits, but can also give rise to substantial costs. And so the Furman report concludes, today, and this was 2019, but I don't think it's different now than then, network effects and returns to scale of data appear to be more entrenched, and the market seems to have stabilized, particularly given the market as it existed in the late 90s or early 2000s, the wild west of the World Wide Web. So that's the context in which we're now going to talk about mergers, and we're going to concentrate on acquisitions by big tech companies. Because the debate that's going on now asks a series of questions. Are startups good for innovation and economic growth? Well, stated that way, of course. Should the desire of startups to be acquired by investors, should the desire of startups and their investors to be acquired by big tech, should that be granted? Should it be recognized? Well, all other things being considered, but does the acquisition of startups, the desire of startups to be acquired, justify competitive harm? That's the way the question comes home in the antitrust context in terms of merger reviews. And what we're talking about is where an agency, it can be in Europe, in the UK, in the United States, in Asia, looks at a proposed merger prior to it being closed and tries to predict what will be the outcome of the merger. Will it be good for innovation? Will it be bad for innovation? So this is from a Richmond Fed economic brief of 2023. Startups are important, new firms, new investment, new innovations. Startups alone are responsible for more than 15% of aggregate job creation. This was as of 2023, according to the sources cited by this paper. But the economic brief continued, the prevalence of startups and young firms has been dramatically declining in the past few decades. So if startups are important, if innovation is important, if innovation is key to productivity and economic growth, we want to know why the decline. This paper offers us a few hypotheses. Let's go through them. One is demographics. There are fewer people in the labor force to start startups. And that, the paper says, is the most popular explanation. The second is the presence of market power. So let me just take a minute on this one. What this means is, would you enter a market, would you want a startup to take on a very big incumbent player that has market power, by which we generally mean the ability to unilaterally raise prices by a small but significant amount? Would a startup want to take on a giant of that kind? And the paper suggests that it's less attractive for entrepreneurs to start their businesses in an economic climate with incumbents reaping more profits, or because incumbent firms are able to put up more entry barriers with increased market power. Now, I want people to stop me if I get deep into lexicon that is too arcane, except for antitrust lawyers. But what we're talking about is a market where there's a, say, big dominant firm, imagine 70, 80, 90% market share, and where there are entry barriers that look like you got to get enough data to compete with a data-driven business, you got to get enough capital, You've got to find a way to get consumers. You've got to get scale to be competitive in the quality of your work. Okay? We're going to come back to this. The third hypothesis is a decline in the intensity of knowledge diffusion. And what that means is, and this, the Richmond paper looks at some scholarship that argues that industry leaders have widened their technological advantages such that new entrants don't think they can leapfrog the incumbents. It's another notion around incumbent advantage. Okay, so that's one set of hypotheses, but there's an important new one, I think new, but recently expressed anyway, which is typified by this research paper by a DC-based think tank. It's a different take. It's that antitrust enforcement over-deters acquisitions. Okay? That antitrust enforcement from 2021 to 2024, the Biden era, cracks down on mergers in a way that over-deters big tech from buying smaller companies. It's an important hypothesis. It's very critical of the Biden era antitrust. It refers to a merger tax. And it says, look, this dynamic undermines innovation, particularly in AI startups, in which there is an interest in having a very vibrant sector. So we've read this paper. John and I read this paper. There's a good deal of analysis of how VCs are working, startups are working. But let's just give some context to the issue. The paper looks at the most recent information put out in late 2024 by the Federal Trade Commission on merger reviews. And this is what the statistics look like. For fiscal year 2022, there were over 3,000 transactions that were reported to federal antitrust agencies, right? The DOJ and the FTC. So over 3,000. There were 47, 1.6%, that went through a full investigation. That's not a lot. There were roughly the same number of merger enforcement actions actually brought by the DOJ and FTC. So we should start with the understanding that a very small number of transactions are really fully investigated or blocked, or even attempted to be blocked in court by the federal agencies. And then Lenny and I went through just different databases. This shouldn't be taken as a finalized research outcome, but we looked at journalism, we looked at reports from agencies, and it looks to us that a very small percentage of big tech acquisitions went through a full investigation. I mean, there are some. We're going to come to Microsoft Activision, the gaming company. There's a pending case about a Facebook acquisition of Within Limited. There was a review of Amazon potential purchase of iRobot, which makes the vacuum cleaners to make dogs crazy, I think maybe sometimes, but a very successful vacuum cleaner, wireless vacuum cleaner company where the deal was terminated. And we're going to come back to this. There's a challenge that the FTC has brought against the acquisition by Meta of WhatsApp and Instagram. So there are some challenges, but it looks to us that even with big tech acquisitions, a relatively small number are challenged. Now, a lot of the criticism here centered on the merger enforcement during the Biden administration that included a new way of thinking or a new set of guidelines for merger review, the 2023 merger reviews. That's a whole nother side conversation. Those guidelines have been criticized, but the one point to remember is the Trump administration, when it came into office, decided to retain these guidelines, not change them. said that they should change in the future based on experience as experience proves them out. But they are in place now under this administration. And interestingly, the Chamber of Commerce put out a survey of what antitrust practitioners thought of the Biden era antitrust enforcers. I think it's fair to characterize the views generally as quite negative. But when this question came up, did the uncertainty that the FTC and DOJ created around the merger process and merger law ultimately had little effect in deterring deals or killing deals in the boardroom? That's the proposition. And we summed up the agrees and disagrees, but a majority of these practitioners agreed that there was little effect. So as a starting point in thinking about this research paper, relatively small numbers of mergers, small percentages are actually challenged. And on the over-deterrence point, Trump administration has maintained the guidelines, and antitrust practitioners don't appear to agree that there was necessarily deals killed in the boardroom because of what was going on. But the more fundamental point is, if somebody says to you, there's over-deterrence of merger activity, how do you tell if it's over-deterrence? The paper looks a lot about startups and startups acquisitions, and that's a piece of it. But over-deterrence, in my view, needs to include an analysis of whether the acquisition of some startups by big tech might or could or has harm competition. In other words, this is my central point today. If you want to think about startups and whether they should be acquired or shouldn't be acquired, or how many should be acquired or under what circumstances, you need to understand the impact on the startups and big tech and the investors in the startups. But you can't reach a conclusion without asking the fundamental question: would acquisitions by big tech, and if so, which ones, harm competition? Because if you're accepting that startups should be acquired even if competition is harmed, that's a different kind of conclusion. It's one that I myself do not reach. So, what do we want? This is from a well-known paper. John has been known to just in the hallway quote this sentence because he likes it so much, but this is by Carl Shapiro and Fiona Scott Morton, among others. It's a paper in 2019. We write in praise of market disruptors, firms that shake up the status quo, threaten incumbent firms, and sometimes transform entire industries. Through this process, which Schumpeter famously called creative destruction, disruptive firms promote economic growth and bring the benefits of new technologies and new practices, business practices and business models to consumers. So there's this notion here that what we really want to make sure is that incumbents are challenged. Okay? And Carl Shapiro, one of the authors of that paper, very well-known antitrust economist, wrote a very famous paper about two economists, and John talked about these in our class last fall, Kenneth Arrow and Joseph Schumpeter. And they're often thought to be at odds with each other. Arrow emphasizes that small firms can be incentivized to challenge the big firms and therefore might develop products that a bigger firm doesn't want to develop or doesn't see any need to develop. And Schumpeter says, well, you know, you want firms to think they can get market power. You want them to think there's some value to their efforts. These are often viewed as in contradiction with each other. But what Carl, as I understand it, says, well, let me say it differently. What I think is that where they come together is with the following notion. When, if new entrants can come into the marketplace and challenge the incumbents, that's a good recipe for innovation. This does not mean that a big tech firm or any other firm cannot acquire any startups. But the market conditions we're looking for is one where new disruptors can come into the marketplace. If the acquisition doesn't prevent that, doesn't raise barriers to entry so high that it blocks new entry, then there can be innovation that comes from the acquisition. But we want to maintain the opportunity for market disruption. The other thing that the Federico, Scott, Morton, and Shapiro paper looks at is this: business stealing effects. Well, business stealing, as I understand it, is one company competes against another to get the other guy's customers, right? And that is what consumers want, right? We look at different services and compare them to see who wants us the most, who's going to give us the best deal. They're very careful. And Nancy has spoken about this, and Nancy and I have written about it. There are times when there can be benefits, synergies, that makes a merger pro-competitive. The innovation is greater than any harm. Nancy and I have thought that historically that's been overstated, but it is absolutely right. This can happen. But a dominant firm may engage in exclusionary conduct to eliminate the threat from disruptive. So this is literature. There's a lot of literature. Bhavani and Jack has pulled much more literature than this that speaks to the question of market structures and innovation. But my point today is, if a merger is going to limit competition, then that is a threat to the innovation that as a society we wish to prize. There's a different technique. It comes to a different point. This is from another DC think tank. And the issue here was the theory that maybe companies in startups won't challenge the big tech guys. Maybe money won't come into startups that wants to challenge the big incumbents, because why? And this paper, stating not its view, but that view, says large tech companies supposedly limit prospective challengers from being able to take root and grow, thereby limiting not only competition, but overall US innovation. So I want you to think about this. There's a market with one big firm. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? It's an important question. And by the way, is it a good thing or bad thing for consumers and competition? Because the hypothesis this paper says is that maybe we don't need to worry about that so much. Why invest in companies seeking to duplicate usually mature products offered by large firms that benefit from economies of scale or network effects? It is better for society if new companies concentrate instead on other markets they can break into. When I started working on this talk, Nancy told me, first thing, I had to talk about this. So I'm talking about it. Think about this language. The suggestion is the society might be better off in some situations if the incumbent monopolies are not challenged, if they go into other markets, complementary markets, adjacent markets. But listen to the language of this. Why invest in companies seeking to duplicate? Well, most companies want to improve upon, innovate upon, differentiate upon. That is the process of innovation, not just duplication. And then why duplicate usually mature products? So let's think about technology for a minute. The iPhone. The iPhone was introduced, the first iPhone was introduced in 2007. Mature here seems to me to mean not so much new innovation. So when has the iPhone become mature in that sense? Never, I don't think, right? In other words, it's a product that is constantly innovated and being improved and changed and different opportunities. And the iPhone is just one example of that. So the hypothesis that new entry isn't really good for society if it challenges the incumbents, it's not really the best way to proceed, I think is a very important issue, because I have noted sometimes in commentary a view that maybe if you've got a really embedded incumbent, you don't worry about that. You worry about what the incumbent does in other markets, but you don't worry about what it does in its home market, because it's just, that's the way it is. And I think this is a dangerous thought, and I think it's not true. And I think it's not true because of what happened in the Google case. This is the case I litigated, giving you my personal views about it. And I'm giving you views about the decision that came out last August. The starting point is that Judge Mehta found that Google, with a monopoly, had unlawfully acted to maintain its monopoly, okay? Is that concept clear? Anybody want me to go through on that more? In other words, you can have a company that has a monopoly, but that makes itself immune from competition so it doesn't lose the monopoly. Maybe it gains more, but it doesn't lose. And that's the kind of theory that was upheld in this liability case. So what's the role of startups? We started off by talking about startups that want to be acquired by big tech. But I've pivoted to the question of, shouldn't startups be prized if they challenge incumbents? And the Google trial gave us a good example of this. There was a company called Neeva. Anybody here ever use Neeva? Anybody here ever hear of Neeva? Anybody want to hear about Neeva? Maybe just for a second. Neeva was a startup. It was started by an ex-Google executive. And it offered subscription-based general search engine. No ads. This was not the only, but a key differentiation. If people didn't like ads and they wanted to get search results, the idea was you could buy a product without ads. And this is not new, as anybody who has a Hulu or Netflix subscription knows and decides how much they want to pay depending on whether they're going to get ads in their TV shows or not. It was privacy. It said it was to be privacy enhanced. It had other features that were not present on other general search engines. But the court held that Neeva couldn't gain a foothold in the market as a result of the Google practices. And put simply, the Google practices were ones that made it harder for competitors to get to users. And of course, if you can't get to customers, you have a problem. And the judge said, the loss of nascent competitors is a clear anti-competitive effect. This is the point. We need to think about startups from the ones that wish to be acquired, of course, but also from the perspective of startups that wish to challenge and the circumstances in which they would be barred from doing so. So I think the Google decision demonstrates that it's anti-competitive conduct, not the mere existence of network effects and scale that can defeat competition and new entry, even in big tech markets. So let's take a minute on this sentence. Remember the Furman report, tipping, scale, network effects can lead to a company market where there's more than one company, but a big company. That's all true. But we shouldn't think that that means competition is impossible. And in the Google case, although it's not a merger case, the finding strikes a chord with me because it says there was possible competition and the possibility was lessened through the conduct that was challenged. The same thing can happen in a merger context. If the acquisition of a company lessens competition, where there could be competition and differentiation, even with network effects and scale, then society has lost and consumers have likely been deprived of additional choices. Now, there's another question. How much do monopolies pay for these startups? This is back to the research paper I talked about. This is a graph. We don't have to go through it really, but please note that the paper pays special attention to Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft. It does an analysis of startups that were acquired at a value below 50 million and above 50 million. It finds during the period it studies, roughly with a lot of emphasis on the Biden years, that there were fewer acquisitions of companies under 50 million. But the paragraph I've pulled talks about the bigger acquisitions. And remember, there are acquisitions. This is, by the way, another point. The notion that there are no acquisitions are going on, I think, is put into question by the fact that such a small percentage are reviewed and blocked, right? That statistics I gave you. But here, just note, there are acquisitions being made by the biggest tech firms, by a bigger set of firms during this period. But what I want to emphasize here is the paper says startups valued at above 50 million, at or above, continued. However, the fact that other acquirers were willing to acquire larger startups does not mean that they were willing to pay as much as large acquirers would have been willing to pay. And here's the question. Is it always a good thing for a big tech incumbent firm or any incumbent firm to pay more than other people? I mean, what is it paying for? It could be paying for the innovation. It could be paying for the benefits it brings consumers. It could be paying to make sure that a challenger doesn't come to market. In other words, it's just as easy to view overpaying as a threat to competition as it is a benefit. And so let's go to the FTC versus Meta case. This is going to come into trial in April, next month. And this is the case where the FTC said that Meta, Facebook, maintained an illegal monopoly over personal social networking with its acquisitions of Instagram and WhatsApp. Anybody here not use Instagram or WhatsApp? Okay. Most of you, almost all of you do. All but one, actually. And the allegation, this is an allegation, the FTC made was that Facebook overpaid for Instagram in 2012 and WhatsApp in 2014 to eliminate nascent threats, right? That's the phrase we heard in the Google decision a few minutes ago. Eliminate nascent threats instead of competing on its own. This is the gravamen of the FTC complaint. And it goes right to the overpaying issue. The paper says, well, the bigger firms would have paid more. But here we have an allegation that it is paying more. That's at the heart of harming competition. Here's what some documents in the case show. Instagram was bought for $1 billion when the valuation, and look, I understand the valuations of privately held companies that haven't gone public is notoriously, right, an art, not always a science, but when the valuation was $500 million, so double, and WhatsApp was purchased for $19 billion when the valuation was 11 to 12.5. In other words, the suggestion that WhatsApp was willing, that Meta was willing to pay more than what the valuation was. It's not uncommon in acquisitions for the buyer to pay something more in a publicly traded company, something more than the stock is trading at. But this was part of the reason why the FTC thought Facebook paid too much and did so to harm competition. This is from a paper by Michael Katz, who's an extremely respected economist. And he gives us some insight into this. He says a high acquisition price indicates that the acquired firm possesses valuable assets, which tends to indicate, all else being equal, it has stronger prospects. In other words, maybe paying more also indicates that there was more competition that could have come. He talks about acquisition of a nascent competitor, the same word now I think we've heard 3 times. But he emphasizes that the competitive effects of mergers can be complex and highly fact-specific. This is correct. My concern about the startup theory is that it doesn't look at the potential anti-competitive effects, and that I think has to be integrated into a full analysis. But one recognizes these, on a case-by-case basis, require really digging into facts. Meta is contesting the case. It's going to trial. And I want to make a point about this. Meta says consumers benefited. Meta spent more, invested more, improved service quality, made product improvements and innovations. Output has exploded, all from the Instagram acquisition. This is what ought to happen. I don't know who's going to win this case, but I know it's being argued in the right way. The FTC is saying the merger harms competition, and Meta is saying, no, it benefited competition. In other words, the issue is joined. It's not asking only, was this the best thing for the startups? It's not asking only if this is the best thing for the investors in WhatsApp and Instagram. It's asking what's best for consumers in competition, and there are 2 very different views, and the trial is going to be held to decide that. So unlike the analysis before, which didn't address the issue, here we have a big tech firm coming in and saying, on the merits, we think what we did was better for competition and consumers. And that's a question to be decided, but not a question, I submit, to be ignored. So I want to go back to the Google case. The way Meta argued it was not the benefit to the startup, or even to itself. It was the benefits to consumers and competition. This is important because companies naturally tend to want to talk about themselves, of course, what's good for them. But what's good for a particular company is not always good for competition. Getting money from a big tech firm, whether for providing services or for selling a company, doesn't necessarily mean that the benefit is shared with society. So here's an example. It's a metaphor because it's not precisely the same issue. But in the Google case, as you may know, Google pays billions of dollars to Apple to get the default in the Safari browser. And Google argued, well, look, we're paying the money. Apple wants the money. It's good for Apple. But the judge said, in deciding whether the contract was exclusive or not, a firm that agrees to distribute only a monopolist product may itself benefit from such an agreement, but that doesn't render it non-exclusive. In other words, a legal conclusion doesn't rest on only whether the benefits go to the company getting money from big tech. I am generalizing this principle. I'm suggesting that if you hear an argument where somebody says it's good for my company, you should consider it. And we need to consider the company's views. But that doesn't answer the whole question in and of itself. Because 2 companies can be very happy, one paying another. But nonetheless, competition can be harmed, consumers can be harmed, innovation can be deterred. So I want to finish this part, and maybe actually I want to leave time for questions. So the ex-ante problem. What I've been talking about is how to assess a merger. But there's important commentary out that says, well, look, you got to think about something else. You got to think about what the effect of these merger reviews are on somebody who's thinking of starting a business. Maybe If they think antitrust is too tough, they won't start the business. Maybe you need to consider how to incentivize people who are starting businesses. That's ex ante, before the review, before the merger. And this research paper we've been talking about does this. It says, what if the prevention of harmful mergers discourages investment in future startups because investors think they won't be acquired? And it talks about the importance to the US economy of startups like AI, which is right, they are important. So there are some people here who were in John and my class last semester, and those people are on the spot now. Because here's the hypothetical I'd like somebody to answer. And I'd like to have both views on it, by the way, pro and con. I want you to imagine that you're enforcing the antitrust laws, okay? And an investment firm has bought company A. It's a 4-firm market, 4, I think that's 4. And it bought company A. And now it wants to buy company B, one of the others of the 4. And your instinct, your initial conclusion as an antitrust enforcer is this would harm competition. It's a 4-to-3 merger. Doesn't mean it's always anti-competitive, but it's certainly within the realm of what antitrust authorities give close scrutiny. But the firm says, look, when we bought company A, our investment bankers promised us we could buy company B. We wouldn't have bought company A if we didn't think we could buy company B. And by the way, you think the investment firm is telling you the truth. And you think if you say no, you can't buy company B, that investment firm might be discouraged from making some investments, and it might tell all of its other friends that, you know, these investments aren't as potentially possible as investment bankers tell them, and that could deter ex ante innovation. You think that's all possible. But you also think the merger could harm competition. What do you do? Okay? I know Jack and Bhavani both want to answer this question, but would like one of you, somebody want to take a shot at this? Anybody want this one? It's going to come back to you, I guarantee you. Anybody have a view that they want to express? I don't want to put anybody in the spot. Okay.
You know, John, that precedent is going to tell, he's going to tell his friends not to take the class next fall because you'll put them on the spot.
I thought he was going to say, he was telling his friends they should take the class because John and I are really interesting, and at the end of the day, we don't put them on the spot. But I agree with you, there's an incentives question. So here's my view. If I'm sitting in that room, and this is inspired by true events, actually. No, I don't want to.
You were sitting in, for the record, he was sitting in the room.
And it seems to me, if you think the competition is going to be harmed, you stop the merger, right? What else are you going to do? That's a concrete harm. Less speculative, more immediate, more concrete, and what I think law and policy acquires. It's not that you want to over-deter anybody, and remember how small a percentage get fully investigated, a small percentage get actually challenged in court. But if you get this situation, I think, just my view, people are free to disagree, you have to say, no, if it's going to harm competition, that's the way the system has to work. So we're out of time. I was going to do the UK and Microsoft Activision, but I want to just come to a conclusion because although it's a great set of issues, we're not going to be able to get through it in time. So let me tell you how I think about this. I think, of course, startups are important to economic growth, and but that includes startups not only that are acquired by big companies, but those that challenge big companies. I think competition drives innovation and economic growth, and that competition is harmed when monopolies block the competitive process. This is not that monopolies cannot innovate, they can. But what we're talking about is blocking the ability of competition to work. I think if the sale of a startup to big tech doesn't harm competition, then of course, what's the problem? But as we just said, I think if an acquisition of a nascent competitor raises barriers to entry, removes a potential competitor in a manner that lessens competition going forward, or is that predicted to, then it's not benefiting consumers, it's not benefiting innovation. These may be a very small percentage of cases, but they're important. And it's important, I think, that when you hear debates about startups and innovation and competition, you just ask yourself, are all the questions being included? Think about what's good for the big tech firms. Think about what's good for the startup, but think about also what's good for consumers and competition and innovation and economic growth. Okay, so thank you for the chance to do this today. And if there are comments or questions, we're happy to take some.
So I've been resisting commenting, and I was going to make some comment about rebuttal, but that's probably not quite appropriate at this point. But I do want to raise some questions for you and for John, actually, to some extent. So if you look at the history of American economic development, innovation has been critical, right? And a lot of that innovation has occurred when large firms have migrated their capacity, used their scale, their scope, economies of scale of one sort, economies of scope, to move into new industries. And they do that, and you could argue that may limit competition, but actually if it's more efficient, it can create more competition, right? So one of the big questions for me is, what about acquisitions to enter new markets? And if you look at a lot of the technological, a lot of large company acquisitions in the tech sector, a lot of them are to move from one industry kind of into a new industry, particularly in an environment where technology is starting to break down the historical norms of what constitutes an industry, right? So it's not, a lot of agencies look at horizontal mergers and then they look at vertical mergers, and that has a certain kind of context of boundaries of industries. But when you have technological innovation, those boundaries disappear. And part of what I want to get at with John is what is the way that agencies should think about that trade-off? And I'll give you a specific example that I lived through. I was at AT&T. I was president of AT&T's international operations. I ran new services for AT&T Wireless. And to use on some of his comparisons, we were bought. AT&T Wireless got bought by Singular, which creatively renamed it AT&T Mobility. But in the process, I know exactly what they paid. They paid $40 billion in cash. And since I had a lot of stock and stock options, I knew exactly what that was as a multiple of the existing value. And it was about 2.5 times the existing value. Now, if you'd looked at that, you would say they overpaid, okay? But the reality is, could you imagine a telecom company today that could exist without a major significant mobile capacity, right? And so you could argue that it was visionary and it was critical to the growth of the telecom sector, but there was some discussion. We were going from 5 major competitors to 4, so it didn't get a lot of scrutiny. But if we'd been going from 4 to 3, how would the agencies react to that? And we know how the agencies, in that instance, my instance, they said no, but Nancy ran this at the, and they said no a couple of times. And in fact, even earlier than that, in 1996, AT&T long distance wanted to merge with Bell South and SBC. because we were arguing that the technology was evolving in such a way that the distinction between local service and long distance service was disappearing. And you need to let us kind of move to this restructured industry. And Reed Hunt, famously, when we asked him if he would allow us to have those discussions, came back and said publicly in the press all over, a merger between AT&T long distance and a regional bell operating company was unthinkable. Okay, and sure enough, what happened over the years is they all merged, right? Eventually, the technology overwhelmed the regulatory structure and the antitrust structure, and they all merged. So my question today is for John, and I'd love to hear other people. When you think about the agencies and you think about the merger guidelines that just came out, will they primarily promote competition by preventing powerful firms from expanding their empires into new markets? Or will they primarily hinder economic growth by deterring acquisitions that allow successful firms to exploit economies of scale and scope to inject greater competition into new markets, not only those just emerging, but also those with entrenched incumbents? And we could actually think about this in the context of AI, like if a large firm wanted to buy a small firm in a different sector of the market, how should the agency, how should they utilize the guidelines to address that question? Sorry, that's a long-winded way to get at it. I was trying to think about how to keep it brief, but I couldn't do it.
So let's just take two cases that the FTC could have looked at. How many people here have Prime Video? Amazon's Prime Video. For every one of you must know by now that Amazon bought MGM. That came up during the Biden era. Amazon wanted to go into a different business, buy MGM, get the lion, among other assets, and it got approved. It was Amazon going into a different sector that was thought by the agencies not to pose any competitive harm, and if there were scale economies, economies of scope, efficiencies, and Amazon owning MGM, that was viewed as not likely to be harmful to competition. But there's a different case, and some of you have heard John and I talk about this before, that the FTC challenged. There was a case called the Lumina Grail. It's very simple. There were two companies, we're going to call them downstream, A and B. And they both rely, this is a simplified hypothetical, and in real life, the FTC did not use hand signals to explain this to the judge, but I'm going to. A and B, they both rely on a single supplier for whom there is no substitute and that provides a critical function to both, an input supplier. The basic theory, which the court accepted, that the FTC brought, is that if company A buys that input, expanding into another market, and it will have the ability and the incentive to shut off competitors from getting that critical input, and that harms competition. So we have examples of both going both ways. I think depending on the facts of the circumstance, the facts and circumstances in front of the agencies, and I think that's the way it ought to work. I don't think there's a single answer as to how the agencies will operate in this context. Anybody else?
Thanks, John. This was great. So to add one layer of complexity, which I thought you were going to get to if you had had more time with Microsoft Activision, is remedies. Because there's the merger, yes, no, good for competition, good for innovation. And then there's the, well, is there something in between? Is there a harm you're identifying? This was in cloud computing related to the gaming industry. But separately, Microsoft was arguing, wasn't as much in the decision that came out, but it was arguing that it really wanted to build an app store and compete with both Google and Apple. And it wanted the gaming assets to be able to have something immediately very valuable that would give it greater opportunities and incentives to invest heavily in that area. You could pick anything you want, but something that could be pro-competitive somewhere else. Not specific maybe to the competitive harm of the merger, but other things they could be doing. This relates a little to, I think, John's example about the technological shifts in telecommunications. And Microsoft makes concession offers, and this is commonly the case in mergers. So does that in any way change the balancing or calculus in your mind? It's a little bit more like adding a little regulatory element on top of a binary decision. Yes, allow merger. No, disallow merger. But there's something else you could do to possibly police against some of the misbehavior. Maybe not prevent the incentive to misbehave, the fundamental problem, if you think the merger is anti-competitive, but limit its impact. Thoughts on that?
I'm going to try to do, I want everybody out by 1 because I know people have other places to go, but I'm going to try to do this Microsoft thing in 1 minute. The Microsoft Activision merger was a lot of emphasis on Activision's call to duty, okay? And what happens is we're talking about cloud gaming. It's growing. Microsoft offers gaming. Activision is the leading creator of games called Call to Duty. John and I once did one of these and we asked whether anybody in the room had ever used Call to Duty, and either nobody would admit it or nobody had. We were never sure which. Activision is not available in cloud gaming. What would happen if Microsoft acquired it? So what actually happens is there's criticism and the replacement of the chair of the CMA this year. And the press says that criticism to the CMA included criticism from the way it treated Microsoft's takeover Activision. So let's see what it ultimately did. First of all, very importantly, Gene, the decision finding there was a problem was focused on what would happen in the United Kingdom. The companies weren't headquartered in the United Kingdom, but the specific findings were there would be harm in the United Kingdom, right? So there's a lot of discussion of was the UK reaching into other countries? No, the UK was focused on what would happen in the UK. And what actually happened was that a remedy was concluded in which Microsoft basically, and this is please an oversimplification, sold the streaming rights of Activision to a separate company for the bulk of the world, so that Microsoft couldn't control whether Activision would be available on multiple streaming platforms for the avowed purpose of providing gamers in the UK with more flexibility and the ability to use mobile phones instead of having to buy dedicated consoles. So to me, I gotta say, and let's just say the United States went a different direction, Europe went a different direction. But this was a situation where the CMA came to the view that what it called divestiture of the rights would incentivize innovation while allowing the merger to go forward. This is a critical question on merger remedies. And on March 12th of this year, the CMA started a new inquiry into how to think about merger remedies. The CMA, a globally respected competition authority, looking at the process of merger review and looking at the question of what can remedy a merger. A topic, by the way, we could spend hours talking about, but we're not going to because we're done for the day. So thank you, everybody.